This episode is exclusively sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim.
Hello, it's great to see you.
Hey, Monty.
Great to see you also.
Hey, today we want to talk a topic that is very important for us in the certainly in research, but also in the swine industry, which is influenza. But specifically, we want to talk about high-path avian influenza, given some of the recent developments of the introduction of the virus that was in poultry into dairy, and that now we refer to it as bovine influenza, but we want to talk about the risk to pigs. And we want to pose the question to our invited guests, whether is the swine industry ready for it and what we can do about it. And to do that, we have invited Dr. Dustin Oedekoven, who is the Chief Veterinarian for the National Pork Board. Hi, Dusty.
Hello, Monty.
Hey, it's very good to have you with us. And I know since you joined the National Pork Board, you've been very busy trying to get ready, always get the producers ready for foreign animal diseases like African swine fever. And I'm sure all that preparation comes very handy as we think about high-path avian influenza and the potential in pigs. So tell us, what are you up to since you joined the National Pork Board, and even how your prior job as a state veterinarian in South Dakota prepared you for this challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Monty, and thanks for having me on the show today. I'm a fan of the podcast here, and so happy to have the opportunity to be with you all today. I've joined the National Pork Board staff a little over 2 years ago as the chief veterinarian there, and as you mentioned, prior to that, was the state veterinarian in South Dakota for 13 years and a little over 18 years total with the Animal Industry Board, the state's animal health agency there. And prior to that, I practiced for a short while in Wyoming. So I'm a South Dakota native, went to South Dakota State University and then down to Iowa State for veterinary school. And so working with pigs, I guess, was an inevitability at some point. And so glad to be with the Pork Board, and especially at a time as they prepare to deal with foreign animal disease threats such as African swine fever virus. And that's been the focus of the swine health team at the National Pork Board really since about 2018 when that virus, African swine fever virus, spread across Asia and got into Europe. And so we've been really busy at the Pork Board in developing materials that help producers be prepared for the threat of African swine fever virus. And so tools like the Secure Pork Supply, helping producers develop biosecurity plans, working with programs like AgView that help to record pig movement and provide that information to state animal health officials for disease control. And then, of course, helping to stand up the U.S. Swine Health Improvement Plan, which is a voluntary standard program that will help producers meet those voluntary standards that help them be prepared for initially foreign animal disease preparedness, but I'm excited to see it moving in the direction of endemic disease control as well, because I think that's where it'll really have some value. So
what's different about this virus? You refer to H5N1, and we had it in the US in 2015, only affected poultry, and that was a different H5N1. Now, in 2024, we have it in dairy. What's different? What has changed?
Yeah, this virus that emerged initially from, I guess it's commonly attributed to a Chinese source where it was first identified. But this strain of H5N1 has been circulating in wild birds and poultry in the United States since February of 2022. And in that time, it has affected many poultry flocks across the United States. And what's interesting is I think we used to see with highly pathogenic avian influenza viruses in poultry, kind of a summer break. You'd get to mid-May, early June, and all the cases would just stop because the heat that was what it was attributed to is the summertime weather came and the virus wasn't as hardy. This is how I frame this up. Whenever we refer to HPAI or highly pathogenic avian influenza, that's the same virus, the H5N1 that is now affecting dairy cattle. But I think it's a mistake to call it HPAI in all other species. It's really that's a term that's listed in our federal code and referred to by the World Organization for Animal Health as it pertains to poultry. And so this virus, and particularly the H5s and H7s, can have devastating effects on poultry, and therefore, in history. Governments have made trade agreements which make it difficult to trade when you have the identification of one of these poultry with these viruses. But they've gone so far as to exclude when you find this virus in wildlife. Okay, so same virus, different response in the same poultry versus wild birds. Okay, and now we're seeing it in dairy, despite the fact it's in 67 other mammalian species. Dairy is being looked at differently. Okay, but what's the issue? Well, poultry. So since 2022, this particular strain, this particular clade has been circulating. Now it's much more widely circulated than any previous highly pathogenic avian influenza. It's globally endemic at this point, and the issue is still that USDA has spent $1.3 billion in the past year controlling this disease in poultry in 49 states. And so it's very extensive in the poultry industry, and they still have trade restrictions that are causing damage to their industry. The other thing, as we've dusted off the response plans that the industry put together with government consultation back with the H1N1 from 2009, that unfortunately became named the swine flu, and that was the pandemic.
Yeah.
Now is referred to as
the key.
Yeah, and it's now referred to as pandemic H1N109, and that strain, if you look at CDC's website, this last flu year, influenza year for humans has been relatively mild, but of the reported cases that CDC tracks, 37% of them this year are due to the H1N109 pandemic strain, and we don't really talk about it. We've moved on and we talk about other things, but the response plans that the swine industry developed in 2009 have been dusted off and are being reworked with H5N1 in mind. But things are more complex now, because at that time it was, I say but it was just a human and pig issue, and the concern was, how do we monitor our workers? How do we explain to the public that things are safe? And now what we have is, well, it's not really an issue in pigs and people, but if it is, gosh, look how the poultry industry is treating the dairy industry with their expectations of not tracking this around, and you can guarantee we'll be looked at the same way in the pig industry. So I think that's a complexity that we'll want to call out.
Yeah,
that's good.
No, and we've learned a lot, so I'm not trying to disregard it. The only thing, Tom, I think just to think it's another influenza, I think it's a bit of an oversimplification, just because this virus has an ability, for being an H5N1, has an ability to, it's different than the traditional avian influenzas. That's what I'm trying to say. It has an ability to get some type of mutations that can be very unpredictable. And it's true that most of the risks up to now, even the role of aerosol transmission and risk to people, is considered to be low. However, the pigs are a different beast when it comes down to replicating influenza viruses. And the way how we grow them, the fact that we have them in a enclosed environment, a lot of exposure, a lot of aerosols, it could change the risk to the people taking care of those animals. And if we just have one person that gets very sick, that could be very, very devastating, right? The good cases here so far is that in dairy, that hasn't been the case, which is great. But in pigs could change very quickly. And that's what the only thing I'm trying to say, because, the risk could be there. So
I know everybody's short on labor and help, but it's really best practice not to allow workers who have influenza-like illness signs to come to work. And one of the recommendations that is out there is for workers to be current on their seasonal influenza vaccine as a method of preventing potential transmission or reassortment of viruses as well. So, I mean, there is a lot of concern about, what if this happens, because it seems imminent, because as Gordon mentioned, 67 or 60 to 70 mammalian species with this. And strangely, the two we commonly think about with flu, humans and pigs, really we're not having a big issue with H5N1. And so, but, all of the work that we've done in recent years for foreign animal disease preparedness and prevention, should be used at this point. We can get some mileage out of the fact that we've been telling people to prepare with their biosecurity plans, and really this is another opportunity to say, hey, it doesn't matter if it's an emerging influenza virus or the threat of a foreign animal disease. Biosecurity matters every day at your front gate, and it's time to review those again because we have this imminent threat that we think probably could be here today, sitting in one of our diagnostic labs, not yet reported. And so I think there's still some science emerging, but one of the immediate questions is, well, how is it spreading? We typically think of influenza virus as a respiratory disease that's spread through contact, but certainly through the respiratory route. Actually, what's being found in dairy is it's more of a mechanical transmission. The udder tissue has a high degree of receptors for the influenza virus, and so as there's contamination between milking equipment and people, that we're seeing that sort of contamination. So one of the big concerns is worker safety, and yet there have been only 4 cases of influenza that identified, all related to dairy workers, and that's always a concern when we're talking about influenza. We know that from years of working in the swine industry. We know that swine influenza has been common, and there are precautions that we commonly share with pork producers and veterinarians. Is there is potential risk of sharing influenza viruses between people and pigs. That's a well-known pathway.
Isn't that the number one concern, though? First of all, Dusty and Monty and Tom, is the human health factor that somehow in the pork industry we could have this potential of transmission to either someone on our staff or in our barn. So that's a good number one concern, I think. And you're right, Monty. Let's keep it that way. That so far that hasn't happened or been identified, but it is our number one concern of human health.
It makes sense to me. I think it's good for our listeners to understand that. From what I gather is those 4 workers that had that drank raw milk, and it was I think it's the pasteurization. Am I correct in that, you guys? That's supposed to be the pathway?
I thought it was mostly considered exposure conjunctivitis, actually, if I remember right on the report.
Pink eye's their main sign, so maybe it's organic material that way that we're thinking possibly. Dusty, do you know on that?
Yeah, I'd have to check on that for sure, Tom, about the raw milk consumption. But I do know that at least the initial case was thought to just have contamination with the milk and then again contact with the face and the mucosal surfaces. But all the cases have been mild. The first 2 were just conjunctivitis, and then there was one that had some mild respiratory signs that they recovered from quickly. But the raw milk aspect, whether that's consumption or I think more what I'm hearing and reading is it's that contact with the raw milk because it has a high viral load in it, and then touching your face. That's
I think Gordon, your point though about the human thing is important because we got to remember our history, right? And there's been I believe, Dusty, you mentioned before we recorded that there's been 3 previous pandemics of influenza that has impacted the human population worldwide in a horrific way. And so certainly we have to have that background whenever a new virus potentially can enter the population that hasn't been seen before. And that probably is what's causing some of that fear. But don't we have to worry a little bit too about the impact on the swine industry? So if it does get into the pigs, what's the potential of what it's going to do to the health of the pigs? And then, of course, those side effects that can happen once you have the virus in there from what the perspective is of the population and regulatory, et cetera, economics.
Yeah. So one thing, actually, maybe going back to what's happening, the situation now in dairy, that I want to reflect for us in the swine industry is also what we are seeing. The study that Michigan did, trying to investigate how some of the herds in Michigan got infected, and then the risk actually, in that case, from dairy to poultry and the spread between herds. And to me, those studies are very, very important and very, I think, relevant to the pork industry, because what they are showing in those studies, to the best of their ability to do those investigations, epidemiological investigations, is that the virus actually move very easily with contaminated materials, people moving between sites without showering, right? Or, sharing equipment, you name it. And I think that's one of the things that the swine industry, you could argue that it's a barrier that we have in place, just part of our day-to-day biosecurity practices, that in some way I think we have to recognize and we cannot take it for granted. But just to say, hey, now it's a time for the producers to really step up or review those practices and make sure they are in place, because we want to protect from PRRS, we want to protect from, PED. And I think those same measures then will help us to keep this high-path avian influenza out, right? So again, Dusty, I'm wondering what sort of, as part of your preparedness plans, how do you see that? What sort of recommendations are coming out of those discussions at the National Pork Board?
Yeah, that's a great question, Monsi, and I think we're watching some things unfold. It reminds me, I was the state veterinarian when PED unfolded, and we saw it come into the country and into our state, and was spread rapidly between swine herds, and everybody said we got to do more on biosecurity. I remember getting a call from a high-ranking state official at the time that said, "Hey, I understand we're able to find this virus at the convenience store and grocery store floor mats. Maybe we ought to tell farmers not to go to those places." And I said, "Well, where are you going to stop with that recommendation, right?" And the point is, thanks for letting me tell a story, but I think what we're seeing now is some concern about that now the dairy cattle are spreading it to the poultry. Well, we need to keep the dairy cattle from dairies from spreading into the poultry. And now what it comes back to is every producer, whether they're a pig producer, a dairy producer, a poultry producer, whatever you've got, you're in charge of biosecurity on your farm. What happens what crosses your front gate is your responsibility. And I think you're right. I hesitate, Monsi, to say we're that much more ready than anybody else, but it has been a routine practice of the pork industry. I mean, it's become a must do. You have to have a biosecurity plan if you're going to be serious in the pork industry today. And this is another reminder, I think, that biosecurity is everyone's responsibility, and it has to be the culture of your farm to watch out for anything coming in. As you mentioned, there are people who may go home at night to family members that work in another industry, another animal ag-related industry where there may be exposure. That could be a dairy farm, could be a poultry farm, could be somebody else's pig farm, or maybe it's a harvest facility of any of those species where, again, the risk is going to be there. And so you need to be thoughtful if you're managing a farm or owning a farm about the people and where they've been, and then what processes or interventions can you build into your daily practice that's just part of the culture and part of the routine. It doesn't matter if it's an emerging strain of avian influenza, potential foreign animal disease, or just your everyday strain of PRRS. That's got to be of paramount importance.
Yeah, that's a great point. That we've got that structure that's been in place for quite a while, and the swine industry, because of our populations that we deal with, the density of our populations. I don't want to sound too pious in this, but we're way ahead of where the dairy industry has been in regards to biosecurity and the avian industry for that matter, and how that biosecurity is done. So that's not to downplay the issue yet in regards to what's happened and what could happen. One thing I did hear, Monsi, that I'm hoping stays true is that it sounds like the transmission of this virus, so far anyway, the chances of it coming through the air are not nearly as significant as other strains of the virus have been in swine populations previously. And if that holds true, that makes the whole preparation thing much easier. Otherwise, this becomes much more challenging if it starts acting like other influenza viruses have in swine populations.
Yeah, that's correct. There is just a study recently published where they put that virus in ferrets, which is, again, that model to look at transmission from the animals to the people or transmission between people. And in that case, the aerosol route was considered very, not very important, which is great. But as you said, there is still unknowns. I think the challenge for the industry, for the swine industry, it's the identification, and now we have a good surveillance program, much better. That's one of the things we learned in 2009. We needed to have a surveillance program in place, and now we have it. So we are already ahead. And then it's about protection, prevention, and worst case scenario is going to be about the control and elimination. And I know we've learned a lot too in the last few years because we have protocols now. I know systems, Gordon, you have experience on that in your own system, and other veterinarians as well in the US about elimination of the endemic influenza viruses, right? We can use vaccines, we can use, management practices to eliminate. So I think we have a better understanding of what to do, even in those positive farms, and get rid of it. So that's another thing. We don't want to have to get there with H5N1, but that's another toolbox that I think we have. Maybe Gordon, you can talk about your own experience on.
Well, sure. There's a long history of influenza, from the pandemic of 1918, right? That Dusty already referred to the basics of the flu in swine. It was always H1N1. That was a traditional, very predictable flu, but that all changed as these new isolates entered. And it sounds like to me, if I'm a listener, number one, I need to educate myself on what's the new situation in dairy and all these other mammals, but then and be aware that it's acting differently in species, poultry versus dairy, as we talked about, and that's probably the difference in the regulatory response. But at the end of the day, do what I know at my farm, because what will help us here in this virus almost generally applies to a lot of other viruses that we know every day, PRRS and PED, and in the case of foreign animal disease, African swine fever. Just one more reason to implement good biosecurity at my farm. And that's what I'm hearing, Dusty.
One other point, though, that I think is important here is the potential economic impact. And I'm still concerned about, even though we have these tools in place. We got Dusty, you mentioned these things in our toolbox that are very good. The secure pork supply plan. We've got traceability programs, very good. We've got surveillance things that can be in place. But the reality is, if and when it comes into the pig population, do we need to have a program in place that will assure our trade partners and consumers that they can still buy pork and feel confident about not getting the virus? And I'm going to be very transparent here. It's right away to me. I go right to this pilot project that we're working on with the Swine Health Improvement Plan, because I believe all the tools would be in place. If you wanted to certify something like this, you've made a decision to do it, you could set your standards pretty quickly based on what's already been done with the pilot for African swine fever, for hog cholera, and now what's going to potentially be worked on with PED, and have a system in place that would really reduce the economic impact.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. And fortunately, influenza is not a disease of I guess international trade impact. It's not listed under the World Organization for Animal Health for pigs. It has been for poultry, and that's the issue that they're fighting right now. Is that there's potential that they could use a vaccine. In fact, some other countries have chosen to do that. France, notably, has decided, they're done fighting this thing without a vaccine or with their arm behind their back, and they're going to go ahead and do that. Our U.S. poultry industry has not completely agreed that that's the best course of action yet, but. And we're also making an assumption that we could use vaccine, and I think that's not as close as we'd like it to be either. This strain was on the select agent list up until about two months ago, which meant anybody working with it had to have the BSL I believe it was BSL-3 facilities to work with it. So maybe it was BSL-2, but at any rate, you've got to have the appropriate laboratory facilities to be able to receive this particular strain and work with it. And then every dose has to be accounted for and all that sort of thing. So now it's come off the select agent list, and I think we're making some advances there, but there's still a pretty tight rein on who's going to be able to make those vaccines and how they'd be distributed, to the point that I think it'd be maybe too late for that first case. Well, we looked at that and said, okay, well, there's a requirement for testing of a certain, subset of dairy cattle would be those that are lactating, that are moving interstate, and that's a small portion of them, but it does include, there are lactating dairy cattle that move interstate, and so a test requirement was put in place, and then a stop movement order, a quarantine for 30 days until they had resolved, the pork and we might. Not only the pork board, but NPPC and AASV and SHIC and the whole group that works together there said, that's not going to work if it comes over to the pork industry. So we were asking those specific questions and providing education to those that are making the decisions about stop movement orders to make sure they understand that can't work at a sow farm. That's just, we're not going to be able to do that. And so from that, that group I just mentioned had dusted off the old H1N1 plan and is circulating that for comments among a small group of regulators and state pork executives to make sure that we have their feedback carefully on how we can move forward, basically to have a plan ready to provide in the event that we have influenza to try to help guide the response.
Will it behave like a seasonal influenza, or it behave like the Spanish flu of 100 years ago? That's always and it's probably something in between or so that's always the fear, right?
Sure.
So, and I think the response is very hard to predict. And obviously that's what you're trying to prevent. But there is a lot of unknowns, so. Yeah.
Well, I wish we didn't have influenza in pigs, but the reality is pigs and this virus get along really well together as a host and as a transmitter. So that's our reality we got to keep dealing with in the industry, right? I mean, it's
well, that's what I think is so strange that again, this backing up to high path AI in poultry used to be something we thought, well, if we identify it, we'll quarantine, we'll stomp it out, and then we'll reestablish our negative status. Well, the virus is global. It's in every region, and it's been there since February 2022. And now we have all these mammalian species, including sea mammals too, and land mammals and mice. I mean, there's another thing we really need to be looking at: rodent control too, not just restricting bird access, but those kind of vectors potentially could bring this in. And yet, we don't have the strain identified in pigs or people.
Let's keep it that way.
What you're saying, Tom, is that's where it's at. So.
Yeah. Anyways, I think we had a good discussion about flu H5N1 in pigs. I think the main take-home message here is that let's keep reinforcing biosecurity. I mean, keeping it away from the herds. I mean, if we think might be there, let's test as soon as possible because we want to find it. That's the other thing. Find it as soon as possible so it doesn't spread to other herds. But let's enforce biosecurity and let's continue working with, in those cases that we have positive in any species, that we don't have that potential to getting people infected. So Dusty, thank you so much for all what you do and all the team at the National Pork Board. We certainly appreciate all the efforts and keeping us healthy and pork healthy as well. So, and with that,
thank you, Dusty.
See you at the meeting. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, guys.
This episode is exclusively sponsored by Boehringer Ingelheim. The views, opinions, or positions expressed are those of the speakers and may not reflect those of any other organization.